There's a new way to stay connected and know what's happening with Market to Market when you subscribe to Market Insider. One email and a lot of information awaits you. Go to markettomarket.org and subscribe to Market Insider. Is it going to be hotter, colder, wetter, more stormy, less stormy, more drought? Let's find out this week. We're going to talk about the weather. We're going to talk about climate. We're going to look at things in the Midwest, the Corn Belt, and across the United States. What factors are shaping up scientifically, and what signs are those for what is coming up in the growing season ahead? We're going to go to Nebraska, to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. We're going to talk with Eric Hunt. He's a doctor. He is the Assistant Extension Educator of Agricultural Meteorology and Climate Resilience. You also see him on Market Journal. He knows a little bit about Market to Market. He knows about what the importance of weather is for agriculture. So we're going to look at the growing season ahead. What signs are there for what is to come? And speaking of coming, we're coming to Nebraska with this podcast here in just a couple of weeks. If you want to learn more, sign up on our website at markettomarket.org or subscribe to our newsletter. We'll tell you all the great details about how you can join us on March 31st in Lincoln, Nebraska. We'll be there, so we want to see you if you're anywhere close. And we also have one other fun road show that we've been talking about in the newsletter. But now let's get into the weather talk with Eric. I've seen Market Journal. I know what it is. How different is it than Market to Market, Eric?
I would say the biggest difference is market to market. You guys focus a lot more on just the actual markets, corn, wheat, cattle, hogs, which is great. I think that supplements Market Journal very nicely. Market Journal, we focus a little bit more on just Nebraska. Market to market is a lot more regional, national. So we talk about more of the research feature stories that are going on around the state. And I think Nebraska has a little bit more diversity in agriculture than, say, some of the states to our east. We certainly have a lot of corn and soybean here, but we have more wheat. We have sorghum or milo, and you got the panhandle. You got dry beans and sugar beets, and you know a lot of the state. We have the largest intact grass and ecosystem in the North American continent in the Nebraska Sandhills. So that's also a very important feature. We have a lot of irrigation. So a lot of things that is a lot more specific to Nebraska we focus on at Market Journal. And I do the weather segment for going on 2 years. So the people in Nebraska are used to me, either fortunately or unfortunately for them.
Did you ever want to be one of the guys in front of the green screen at 6 and 10 o'clock at night?
You know, I never did, but I have to say that I really enjoy getting to do those weather segments. And something else that's been fun, I started a TikTok page back in September with help of an intern. And I go out there to our Hardin Hall Prairie outside this building that I'm in. And I just filmed myself talking about the weather for 3.5 minutes. And I have a blast doing that. I really do.
Do you, well, I mean, I forget, are you certified meteorologist?
Well, I have a PhD in natural resource sciences, a bachelor's in meteorology. So yeah, I would call myself a meteorologist. I don't have the AMS broadcast seal. I actually have no training as a broadcaster whatsoever.
So perfect. Why don't you be on television every week?
Yeah, of course.
Well, any monkey can do it. I'm proof right here. I mean, there's not much else about it.
Same here.
Eric, you grew up in various places, spent some time in Illinois, but you're in Nebraska. It's home now. You talk about all the different crops. How is it to make sense of weather in Nebraska and how each different type of weather impacts everybody differently?
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, weather in this state varies significantly sometimes, as it does in other states in this part of the country. But, you know, especially early spring, you could have people planting soybean in far southeast Nebraska, and they're still trying to find cattle out of a blizzard in the panhandle. That's not unusual. And, you know, what is really beneficial, like say, for example, you know, cattle, the rangeland guys, particularly the guys that have feedlots, they probably want it dry at certain times of year. Maybe the wheat farmers want it a little bit wetter. In general, you know, I don't think anybody wants excessive moisture in the spring here, because that means that corn and soybean aren't getting planted on time. That's also not great for wheat finishing off. Now, you want some moisture for wheat, but you don't want too much moisture for wheat. Probably the biggest issue maybe would come in the fall when, you know, wheat needs decent moisture in October, especially late September, October, is that fall precipitation for winter wheat is very, very critical, perhaps even more critical than I initially realized after spending some time talking with wheat breeders. Guys trying to get their corn and soybean out of the field are a little bit less enthusiastic about raining a whole lot in October for good reason. So there can be some competing interests. Certainly, I've been in the state for a long time. What's really good conditions for corn and soybean, if prices are really good for corn and soybean, yeah, sometimes that high corn price maybe isn't so good for cows. So I guess there could be a benefit that sometimes the cattle market could be really good. Maybe the corn market's a little, maybe not so good.
Mhm.
But in general, and sometimes they're both down and sometimes they're both up.
Well, and then you have this whole dry land thing to figure in, and you can say, well, in this area there that hasn't rained, but then you look at their crop and it looks like it's rained because they can irrigate. And
Yep.
then they have the dry land area. So I mean, you have all of these crazy
We,
factors to deal with.
we do. So the southeastern quarter of the state is almost entirely all rain fed, like it is in Iowa and Illinois, and, the rest of the Corn Belt. Northeast Nebraska is a little bit more mixed, but there's still quite a bit of dry land. So really, Lincoln is sort of the cutoff for dry land. But even if you go to the very southeast, it's not that uncommon to find drain tile with rain-fed agriculture, which is certainly not the case for most of the state. I would say the prime irrigated acreage would extend from a little bit west of Seward, which is about half hour west of Lincoln, over to about Kearney. So that south central section of the state, that's really the prime irrigated acreage. It's really good ground, fertile soil, and in general, there's ample supply of groundwater for us to be able to put on. Um, so I would say in that area, it's more truly, especially once you get over toward like York and Fillmore counties, it's probably more truly supplemental. They're able to get really high end yields with, say, 4 to 7 inches of water a year. You get west of Kearney, it starts becoming more truly essential. And if you get in the western portion of the state, it is truly essential to actually have irrigation to grow anything that's high yielding. You do get into the southwestern corner of the state, though. You get in a lot of areas, you get in a lot of natural resources districts which we refer to as fully and over appropriated. So out there, they have a lot more stringent regulations on how much water you can pump. So what you'll see there is people will keep maybe some of their best acreage in irrigation, maybe the less stellar acreage gets put into dry land. And if it rains, they have a decent crop. If it doesn't rain, they don't. They're not necessarily dependent on that. A lot of times they're a little bit more diversified in their operations out in that part of the state. So it just gets very, very different when you get out there. Most of the irrigation of the state is done through center pivot. You do still see some flood irrigation, particularly if you get near some rivers. And then, you get out in the panhandle, they mostly are irrigation. There's a little bit of dry land, but they also irrigate a little bit of wheat out there, which is not as common in, say, like parts of south central, southeastern Nebraska where there's some wheat. But there's been a pretty big shift. So the area where I live in, prior to the mid 1990s, so prior to genetically modified corn seed, this was mostly sorghum country and wheat country. You had to go to the county east, so the very eastern counties along the Missouri River were the edge of the traditional corn belt. This area was mostly wheat and sorghum, and then you went west of here or up north into Saunders County, you found more irrigated corn, soybean. I think soybean came into the state a little bit later than it did in parts of Iowa, but it's been pretty predominant as part of the rotation for the last, say, 30 years. So we have transitioned into this area looking a lot more like the areas to our east in the last couple of decades.
Well, and the corn production numbers reflect that there's more corn acres in places like Nebraska, South Dakota, North
Yep.
Dakota, as seed technology has changed over the years. And so that puts in, we could get into a whole nother discussion about what it's done to aquifers and water tables and things like that. But let's talk about what is above ground right now. And if I look at the drought monitor, that the most recent one that came out, the areas that you were referring to, the western part of the state where we always think of it is dry, it is red right now. It is dry there. How long has that been going on out there?
Well, if you get to the northern part of the Nebraska Panhandle, you get into parts of South Dakota and eastern Wyoming, that's been going on since early last summer. So they kind of had a dry spring, and then once you got into summer, they just weren't getting the moisture. So you started seeing the drought show up on the drought monitor. That started kind of slowly expanding toward the north and toward the east throughout the summer. And then most of the state, and certainly once you got into Iowa and Illinois and parts of a lot of the Corn Belt, really, got through most of last summer without having any major drought issues. Then we got into late August and September. Things really just dried out. We had a lot of what we call upper level ridging sitting over us last fall. So we had very little precipitation and very warm temperatures. So we actually saw what I would call a very late season flash drought across the Corn Belt. And we saw a lot of 2 and 3 category degradations on the drought monitor from basically almost nothing to, in some cases, severe drought. There were pockets of northeastern Nebraska that were in extreme drought for a little while in the fall. There's still some problems up there. And I would say if you look at a lot of Nebraska, Iowa, Minnesota, parts of Illinois, there's a lot of moderate drought, which is to say that it's not the worst of the worst, but we need to get the moisture the next month, month and a half. We do not have a lot of soil moisture right now. So we take a look at soil moisture percentiles across this region. You'll see that you'll see a lot of dark red there across a lot of Illinois. Now, that does not mean that you literally have no soil moisture there in central Illinois. This is soil moisture percentiles from a robust land source models. This is the NASA Land Information Systems. I used to run this in a previous position, this model in a previous job. But what this shows is the reflection of, for this time of year, are we relatively wet, relatively dry, or kind of in between? And a lot of places we're just kind of dry. I do think a couple of really good rain events would take care of a lot of problems in Nebraska, certainly the eastern portion of Nebraska and Iowa. And I think in Illinois, I think we're going to get the rain that we need here the next month or so. So I'm a little bit less concerned about that area. But when you get out in the high plains region of western Nebraska, western Dakotas, prospects there are just not as good. And we need a lot of moisture out there to eradicate some of these longstanding drought conditions. I'm also getting concerned about the southern high plains region. It doesn't show up as well in the soil moisture percentiles map, but they've been pretty dry down there of late. And I'll get into this a little bit later, but we're moving into a pattern that isn't necessarily as conducive for that region, always get as much moisture. If you get to the eastern portion of the Corn Belt, though, things really have improved a lot. The parts of Indiana, Ohio had one of their driest seasons on record, maybe not on record, but certainly worst they've had in a long time. We've had a lot of moisture in those areas starting late last fall, getting into this winter. And so things really are a lot better right now in parts of Indiana and Ohio than they were 4 or 5 months ago.
And we look at river basins. I look at the Missouri River Basin. I mean, where the Missouri starts, yes, it's not in drought. But as it picks up steam, it's dry.
Yep.
And as it bends there in central Missouri, we've talked about the I-70 corridor. A lot of snow this winter, east to west, or west to east there. But it is that Ohio Valley that does seem to have less drought conditions right now. So you hear this question a lot. What is the impact of the way this drought monitor sits right now when we come out of winter here, hard winter in the next week or so? What's that do to shipping on the Mississippi? Because that always seems to be a big discussion.
Yeah, so the good news for the lower Mississippi is since the Ohio Valley region has had a lot more moisture in the last, say, couple months, and some areas of Kentucky and Tennessee had historic flooding here earlier in February. So the flows of the Ohio River up quite a bit, and that flow in the lower part of Mississippi, I believe, is up quite a bit. But we're still struggling a little bit further north in the Mississippi. So the northern half of Mississippi, the flows are down, and we are going to need a lot of moisture to really, this spring to help with that. And if we look at the soil moisture percentiles, a lot of that moisture, especially if it comes in a nice way, which is great for agricultural producers getting a recharge of soil moisture. But if there's not a lot of runoff, that means that the rivers aren't going to go up as quickly. And you mentioned that snowfall, that's important. So a lot of years we'd be looking at there to be a pretty decent snowpack in the northern plains, upper Midwest to melt off and help us get that recharge into the river. Not going to have that this year. We have had very, very little snowfall across a lot of the Midwest, upper Midwest in particular, so far this winter. Some parts of southern Minnesota really are running, 2 to 2.5 feet worth of deficit for snowfall so far this winter. So I do think there's going to be continued pressure on the northern half of the Mississippi in terms of the flow, unless we just have a super wet spring. That is going to be possible. I do think some of the tributaries into Mississippi from the east will be improving. I'm a little bit more skeptical of the Missouri running super high this spring, which would help the flows into the Mississippi. So I do think that's going to be something to watch for as we move into the summer.
We always need to know what the weather patterns are and where we're at, where you and I are sitting. It matters several states away on the ocean and the temperatures. What are they telling you right now?
Sure. So we are still in La Nina, and I know, especially once you get on our part of the country, La Nina is not a four-letter word per se, but it's not necessarily our friend a lot of years. And if you look at where we hit, so La Nina, we look at that in the central and eastern equatorial Pacific. So right now we see a blob of blue on the current sea surface temperatures map. So that indicates colder sea surface temperatures. So earlier in the winter, so if you go back about 6 weeks, we saw more cold water closer to South America. We have seen some of those easterly trade winds back off a little bit in that region. So we've seen the reduction of upwelling. So we are getting more warm sea surface temperatures over there. So right now that La Nina is barely very, very focused on the central Pacific. We would probably refer to this in meteorology as a Madoki La Nina. The expectation right now, as we look for the forecast, the climate prediction centers official projections right now are for us to remain in La Nina through early spring. Then, as we get into spring and summer, right now it's kind of there's a better chance it's going back into neutral. I do think we are getting close to being back into what we call neutral conditions. So, kind of a mix of cooler and warmer sea surface temperatures in those specific basins. And if we look into the summer, there's a chance that we could stay in La Nina. There's a chance we'll be in neutral. There's even a chance that we will go into El Nino as we head into the later portion of the summer and into the fall.
Isn't that what I heard though last year at this time? That's where we were headed? Wasn't that the talk at this time?
At this time last year, we were in El Nino. We were starting to come out of it. We were heading into neutral, and there was an expectation that we would head into La Nina. We didn't get into La Nina as quickly as I think was projected this time last year. We didn't officially get declared into La Nina until about Christmas, even though there were certain things that were reminiscent of La Nina probably back in October. I would say the weather pattern this year has been somewhat, reminds me of La Nina, but certainly not in every case.
And to define La Nina and El Nino, it doesn't necessarily mean more moisture or less moisture or regular or buckets of water, which we had in, you mentioned Minnesota and parts of Iowa last year.
Sure. Yeah. El Nino, La Nina are only referring to the sea surface conditions, meaning warmer or cold sea surface temperatures, depending on. So warm central eastern Pacific is El Nino. That also means you tend to have more anomalously westerly winds as opposed to easterly winds like we have with the La Nina. Those go back and forth over time. They're natural oscillations. They do have a big impact on weather throughout the entire globe. And our part of the country, our part of the world, they both have an impact. It's debatable how much impact they have some years versus others. The issue we have with La Nina, particularly Western Corn Belt, Central Plains, High Plains in general, we do tend to have more ridging sitting over us late summer, early fall. So we tend to have drier falls, which means that we're missing out on a period of potential recharge of soil moisture, meaning we're going into winter with less moisture than what we maybe would prefer to have, which means that we have to have good snowfall that winter. We haven't really had that this year. And we have to have really good moisture in the next spring. And if you get that good moisture in the next spring, then that dry fall isn't necessarily as much of a problem. There are benefits to having a dry fall. It means you tend to get the crop out of the field pretty quickly, as opposed to the year you have wet fall. Maybe it could be a little bit slower. But right now we are entering into a situation where we do need to have decent moisture in the month of March and start of April for us to have a reserve of moisture going into this growing season.
And if we get that wet spring, Sue Martin would tell me, and she'll tell me here in a few hours when she's on the show, you plant your crop in mud, it's going to be a dud. But at the same time, a little bit of weather premium is something that maybe the market does need on an occasion. And you're not predicting that, but you're just saying that's always the potential.
Sure. Yeah, my family has a little more colorful version of that plant in the mud quote, but yes.
Yeah, I don't have my swear button beeper right here, but if I did, I'm sure we could probably do that. Okay, I've seen this next map. It's full of color, and I never fully get it explained. You call it the analog perspective. What am I looking at, and what does it mean?
Sure. So what I'm showing you here are years where we were coming out of a La Nina going into the spring. So March 1st is technically the start of meteorological spring. Meteorologists like things to be orderly. So we categorize March, April, May, spring, June, July, August, the summer, so on and so forth. What you're looking at here is showing, we like looking to see where we have ridges and troughs in the middle and upper part of the atmosphere, because that means that's where the weather is coming from. And if you tend to have troughs in certain places in the North American continent, that tends to mean the storm track is going a certain way. So what we're looking at here, when we have troughing in the northwestern portion of this continent, that means in the spring, we are getting a storm track that's bringing flow into California and probably coming up toward the northeast into the middle of the country, going up and around that ridges over the eastern United States. We tend to have our best rising motion to the east of the troughs. That's I'm not going to get into meteorology, but basically we tend to have our best rising motion to the east of those troughs. So that would this type of pattern would mean certainly there would be chances getting some beneficial moisture into the Central Plains. This certainly is a good signal for moisture in Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, the lower part of the Mississippi Valley. This also can mean at times a severe weather signal for portions of the Southeast. So like 2011, for example, which I'm seeing as an analog, that was a very active severe weather across a lot of the Mid-South and Southeastern U.S.
And that gives then, it sounds like, that discussion explanation when we talked about Ohio and Pennsylvania, where they had started to get rain. It's usually the drought starts to relieve itself back to the west, move backwards where it's no longer in drought. And that kind of sounds consistent with what you were saying earlier. Or am I not hearing that right?
Sure. So I think I am fairly confident we will get some decent improvement in drought conditions across a lot of the Midwest. So certainly if you have drought right now in your backyard in Illinois and Wisconsin, maybe even eastern Iowa, I think there's a pretty good chance you're going to get the moisture you need in the next 6 weeks. If you live in Indiana, so farmers in Indiana, Ohio, I have more concern right now of you being excessively wet at times this spring, because if we get in a really active pattern, there's not too many ways you're going to miss out on moisture in the next couple of months, potentially, if things are shaping up like we think they might be. I think there's more concern for dryness as we get further toward the west. I think eastern Nebraska, if you look at the CPC outlook, they're favoring kind of equal chances. Basically, there's no real strong signal favored either way. Most things I've looked at right now are, you get to western Iowa and eastern Nebraska, it's sort of a transition area where we could be fairly good this spring, may not be great. The prognosis gets worse as you get further toward the west into the western half of Nebraska and into the further south into the High Plains region. I do think the prognosis in the southern High Plains actually is not that great. There's definitely, I think, going to be some drought pressures forming in that area. But yeah, the eastern side of the Midwest, east of Mississippi, I feel pretty confident moisture. And yeah, Indiana, Ohio, it could be 2 wet at times this spring. It may be even an issue with planting. I actually had a guy, from Schuyler, Nebraska, asked if there was going to be an issue with prevent planting in parts of the Eastern Corn Belt this year. I said, yeah, I think that could be an issue.
Again, little weather premium coming to the markets. All right. When you look at your seasonal temperature outlook, and it kind of over in the same slide here with the precipitation outlook, it doesn't look like conditions are improving for the southern United States, Arizona, New Mexico, and especially in Texas. And your head says I've struck a chord. Why? What's going on there?
So this type of pattern is, again, I do think there's in the next 10 days really chances to get some moisture in parts of the Southwest, but the type of pattern that we're heading into coming out of La Nina is just typically not the friend of the Southwest and parts of Texas. We tend to have more ridging there. The storm track tends to be to the north. All the better moisture tends to get shunted off further toward the east. We're not tapping into if we're not tapping into a strong subtropical jet, we typically don't get a lot of decent moisture in the spring in the Southwest. Now, some years we can get that. This year that is not favored. Not saying that can't happen. Meteorologists are always wrong. But right now, the prognosis for the Southwest is not good. And there's some very, very severe to exceptional drought conditions across a lot of the desert Southwest, getting into northern Mexico. And I think that's a problem really for more of the High Plains region, because if we are getting southwesterly flow at the lower levels in the atmosphere and at the surface over that area, that just means it's an extra dry wind. And one reason I do think severe weather could be an issue once we get certainly into eastern side of Oklahoma and further east, years like this, that dry line can be artificially pushed further toward the east deeper into Oklahoma and Texas. and that can really help mean, that a lot of the tornadoes form along that dry line because, severe weather in general can form along that dry line because you have tremendous gradients of uh, moisture. So you have really, really dry air going up against really, really warm, moist air, and that creates some really strong rising motion. If you have the wind shear, you can get some really explosive thunderstorms. Years like 2011, I think even in some case 2022, we saw more of that a little bit further toward the east into parts of eastern Oklahoma, Arkansas, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama. So it's possible that if we see some of these deeper troughs getting into, say, Colorado and Kansas, and we have that dry land pushed further toward the east because of dry conditions further toward the west, then I think that is a setup that could be favorable for the lower Mississippi, mid-south regions to have some severe weather this spring. Again, it doesn't mean that's going to happen. That there is historic precedent for that to be the case this coming spring.
Well, and then we have to get into the discussion of is Tornado Alley moving? And it's just, I don't think it is. It's just or is it? I'm not going to put myself as an expert
research
here.
that does show that in the last few decades, 2 to 3 decades, we have seen more tornadoes in Arkansas, Tennessee, southern Illinois, further east where we traditionally would have them in Oklahoma, Texas, southern Kansas. I would probably argue Nebraska, western Iowa has never really been in the true tornado alley, but we certainly have them. We certainly have them up here. Now, 2024 is a very active year for severe weather in the Western Corn Belt, a lot of the Central Plains, in a way we probably haven't had in a while. But we have definitely seen in recent decades some of that maybe shifting a little bit. I think the jury's still out as to exactly if that's a permanent shift or that's just something we've seen in the last few decades. There's probably arguments both way on that. That's probably a story for a different day on some level.
Well, the shirts that I see, they all say it's a cyclone state. So I don't know what that means. That could mean something completely different. Oh, it's sports. Oh, they're telling me now it's sports. Okay.
Iowa State's kind of, you guys are better than us at football. Have been for a while. You got a really good men's basketball team.
We could totally do a whole half hour about the rise and fall of Nebraska football.
With the Hawkeyes, we do with the Cyclones. We were okay with the Cyclones. The Hawkeyes, that's a different story.
Well, that's because you were always beating the Cyclones. Now that the Hawks beat Nebraska, it changes and Iowa they just say, well, we need a rivalry. We needed somebody where they can win. Well, they went and did that this year. So you talk about spring weather. You mentioned, severe weather possibilities in certain locations, flooding, prevent plant, anything outside of, is there maps that give you, do those align in helping you to your conclusions of what we may see?
Sure. So if you look at this analog perspective here, where we have temperature and precipitation, so temperature on the left and precipitation on the right, you'll notice that with that troughing being more prominent over the northwestern United States, we tend to have colder temperatures. Where we have more ridging prevalent over the southern eastern U.S., we tend to be warmer than average. And, if we're at that storm track coming in where we tend to maybe would think that, we get some areas of low pressure forming off the lee of the Rockies and moving in toward the Midwest. That tends to mean we get decent precipitation. We can get it in the Central Plains. We certainly will get it in Illinois, Indiana, especially once you get down to the lower Mississippi or mid-Mississippi Valley, southern Missouri, Arkansas. We tend to get a lot of precipitation some of these springs. Now, again, that's not a guarantee this year is going to look like that. But if there are places where I would expect there to be more precipitation than average this spring, it would be Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee. The jury's out. I think there's opinions are a little bit more mixed in Iowa and Nebraska. I do think there's going to be chances to get some precipitation this spring. But I would say, though, we can't afford to have a really dry spring in this, certainly not in our area.
And then when we turn to summer, is there an ideal situation for anybody? And what does that even look like?
So an ideal summer, looking at it from an upper air standpoint, would mean, we probably have a lot of ridging that would be prominent for most of summer across the northwestern Canada and Alaska. And when we have that, means we get really strong troughing that would kind of be more prominent over the Great Lakes. Now, in the winter, this would be very cold for the eastern part of the United States. But in the summer, what this does is it does a couple of things. One, it means that we're getting routine cold frontal passages. And as long as we have latent moisture and in the soil in their soils, and our crops aren't stressed, meaning that they're transpiring. Frontal passages coming through in the summer often will produce precipitation across the most of the central U.S. will get some precipitation. So we're getting that. That also means that we're getting cooler high temperatures. So we're having fewer days that are, putting heat stress on the crops. But maybe more importantly, we're getting cooler nighttime temperatures. So we definitely have seen a trend in recent years with, with warming, that we are getting warmer minimum temperatures. A pattern like this would keep us have a lot of nights in the 50s. That means longer grain filling. That's ideal for getting. So if we want to obliterate our soybean and corn yield records, we want an upper air pattern that looks a lot like this, like we saw in 1994, 2004, 09, and 14. Now, granted, I do not want a fall that is like 2009 again anytime soon. But the other 3 years, there was a lot of what I kind of call more ideal conditions. And if you look at sea surface temperatures in those years, there's a reason I'm showing this. So in those years, we tended to be not really strongly in El Nino or La Nina. It was kind of more neutral, and we were warmer than average across the northeastern Pacific basin. So South Alaska over toward California, we tend to be a little bit warmer for sea surface temperatures, and that's important because that tends to mean that we'll have more ridging off the west coast. When that's cold, and I'll show you this here in a little bit, that tends to mean more trouble for us in this part of the country.
Well, why don't you fly through the end of your presentation here that we've set up, because then I have one good question at the end. So walk me through what you have.
Sure. So in terms of if you look at those years when they're ideal, that means that we're getting moisture everywhere. We're not getting excessive amounts of moisture anywhere, and we're cool. And then if we were going to have just an absolutely just 1993 type steer, we're going to have lots and lots of flooding. That we're going to have a spring type pattern that trough sits in the northwestern United States for a long time. That means we have a lot of southwest flow into the United States. We have open access to the Gulf. We just have thunderstorms just constantly across the entire Corn Belt, and we would just be excessively wet from basically central Nebraska into Indiana and from Kansas up to Minnesota. So that basically would soak the entire region. And those years, we actually saw some pretty big yield reductions because of the amount of flooding. That also would be a very cool summer across the northern plains, warmer than average across the southeast. And then if you want to, now again, I'm not a market specialist by any stretch of imagination, and I'm not going to say that if we had, 1988 style drought that we'd have $7 corn. But, if we were going to have a massive drought that would affect the entire region, it's going to look like what I'm showing you on the left for the upper air pattern, meaning we probably would have a persistent trough in the Gulf of Alaska off the northwestern United States. We would have a strong ridge sitting kind of over the north central portion of this continent. And that would be a pretty predominant feature through most of summer. In sea surface temperatures, that water would be cold across the Gulf of Alaska. That basically means if that happens, the atmosphere at some point in the spring has lost its momentum. It means that warmer water from the western side of the Pacific isn't being pushed toward the east. We get more upwelling, and if we get colder water, that tends to help reinforce troughing in that region. And especially in midsummer, we tend to see that ridging over the north central portion of this continent. One telltale sign that I always watch for, when the eastern side of the U.S. starts getting ridging more predominant in the, say, late April, May timeframe, because it often retrogrades toward the west in the late spring and summer. And if we start getting really dry across portions of the southeast, mid-south region, that tends to retrograde or tends to move up toward the north and northwest through the summer, in part because if they're going over dry, that return flow from the Gulf, we want that moisture from the Gulf to not lose any of its pep once it gets, but we want it to be just as moist as it is in over Arkansas. If Arkansas, Tennessee, southern Illinois, if they're really dry, that moisture coming back up into Iowa, northern Illinois, eastern Nebraska doesn't have as much latent moisture. So that means that the overall flow kind of gets cut off when we get these ridges set up, and so we lose our atmospheric forcing, and we don't have the moisture return. So those are all things that can help lead to suppressed precipitation. And once we get a large portion of this region with low soil moisture, then we start having reductions in crop evapotranspiration that affects how the lower boundary layer behaves, and we tend to reinforce hot, dry conditions, sort of by nature. And again,
you've hinted about a couple of years that this reminds you of. Are we setting up for There's no carbon copy, but is there something that rhymes like this year shaping up?
Well, yes. I think if there's a year that looks like what the CPC is showing and what some of the other outlooks are showing, 2021 does seem to ring a bell a little bit. And that year, we tended to have a lot of upper level ridging over the northwestern portion of the continent. Now, that it did extend further east into the northern portion of the United States. Statistically, that was a very warm summer from basically the entire, grain. I'm going to call it the entire grain belt, so North Dakota down to Kansas, over in Ohio. A lot of that, though, was early. That was front loaded. We had a lot of that heat early in June. So once we got to the middle of the growing season, we weren't really having too much heat pressure. We also were statistically dry across the western portion of the Corn Belt, but we were getting timely rains that summer. And I think what's really important about that year, and I think the reason that year wasn't a huge problem in our area, is because we had a lot of moisture in March that year. So we had some long-standing drought conditions from 2020. So similar to this year, we were going into March dry. We had a lot of moisture that really eradicated a lot of soil moisture concerns. We went into that summer with decent moisture, and once it got hotter and drier, we were able to withstand that. If we end up in a pattern like we had in early June that year, where we have massive ridging over the north central United States and get some hot, dry conditions, things may turn a lot more quickly than they did that year without that moisture. So I think I think that year worked because we had that antecedent moisture. We need that moisture this spring for 2021 to look like it did. But suffice to say, 2021 is not the worst analog. 2022, I think, also could be one that's not good news for Nebraska. So I think if we don't get the moisture this spring, I think the western side of the Corn Belt, certainly the Nebraska side of the Corn Belt, I think could be in for some issues. I'm less concerned about drought pressure in the eastern half of the Corn Belt. At least right now, I'm not seeing much signal for that to be a problem so far this year. So I'm not seeing a sign that there's going to be a Corn Belt widespread massive drought that would take our corn yield down by 20 percentage points. That really is actually a fairly unusual condition that happens fairly infrequently. I don't see that coming this year. Not saying it can't. We already have some. But again, a lot of that's going to depend on how much moisture we get this spring. If March and April are dry, we could be in trouble.
So that means we'll have you on in the middle of the summer. We're in the middle of drought, and I'll have to say I told you so, but I don't know. That's that's the life when you stick your neck out like that, Eric. But scientifically, that's what it looks like to you. I totally get it.
Yep, absolutely. That's my story for now. I'm sticking to it until I have better evidence otherwise.
There you go. Eric, I appreciate the time and the insight, and thank you for all the colorful charts and explanations of them.
Thank you very much, Paul.
My thank you to Eric Hunt, and thank you for watching, listening, and reading. We hope you enjoyed this installment of the podcast. New episodes come out each and every Tuesday. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.